Yakri here with another Dominions 5 video. So this time I want to talk about blesses, right? Since they've changed quite a bit in Dominions 5 from Dominions 4, and they're fairly complicated in general now. So it's a pretty good topic to cover in depth. I'm going to link a forum post in the description that goes to this fairly detailed explanation of the different bless options in the game. Now, I really don't agree with some of the balance evaluations of what this guy thinks are good. So I think it's a little questionable, his judgment on balance for blesses, but it outlays all the information about them in excruciating detail, which is very handy. So it's a very good reference tool regardless. But yeah, I'm going to go over all the different blesses in the game and talk about which ones are good and why they're good, in my opinion. A quick note to start with also, so I've set up a god from Marignon here, and you'll notice that I have 6 bless points, right, in fire and 4 in air, but I've put the same number of points into fire and air. This is because some nations that have strong associations with national paths have a bonus to their bless points. I'm not sure if it's mentioned anywhere which nations get a bonus. Marignon is one of them, however, and you may find others. This video is also going to be broken up into several parts. One for each part should cover 2 magic schools. Okay, so let's talk about fire magic. Fire magic is a pretty good bless option in general. There are several decent things in here, some less great but neat utility blesses as well. So starting from the top, we've got superior morale, very bland, not very good. There's nothing wrong with more morale. You certainly want more of it, but spending a bless point on it is a little... I'm not enthusiastic about it, let's put it that way. However, it's fairly easy to put yourself in a situation where you have nothing else to spend a single point of fire on, such as if you've got a major fire resistance bless, right, with 4 fire points, you'd only have 1 point left over, and you'd have to spend it on superior morale. All right, so it's better than nothing, but it's a little lackluster as some of the 1 point blesses go, and we'll talk about precision down here in air, and this is what an example of something that's far more desirable is a little a 1 point bless that you can either use for splash or intentionally as a valuable bless. Alright, so major and minor fire resistance. Well, if you have some reason to need fire resistance, these are a great choice. Otherwise, they're not. Fairly self-explanatory. I think discussion of when to pick these is a little more national specific. So, maybe someday I'll be reviewing a nation and mention that they have some particular benefit from these resistances. Although one extra note is that death explosion, this is probably not useful. But let's say you wanted to find a way to make this useful. It causes your units to explode in a fireball and deal 10 AP fire damage around them in a large AoE. Now, this will kill your other death explosion units, causing a chain reaction which will blow up your whole wave of death explosion units, which sounds pretty fun, right? Except that a lot of those units are not going to be near enemies, and you'll just waste their lives. So if you give them major fire resistance, right, they're going to be protected from that AP fire damage for the most part, and it's likely that they will not die from death explosion, whereas your opponents will hopefully not have any such protection. So that might be one reason to grab major fire resistance. Of course, it's a little excessively expensive to go up to 5 fire for death explosion, then go all the way up to 8 fire and get major fire resistance. So perhaps not a viable strategy. However, it's an example of something you could do with it. Another reason to pick it, in general terms, might be if you intend to cast fireballs. Nations that have a great deal of fire magic, but for some reason their blessed troops don't have fire resistance naturally, could get some good use out of minor or major fire resistance to protect them from friendly fire. Or if you expected to be playing against Abyssia in any age and think there'll be a major problem for you, having fire resistance would be quite handy. But like I said, there are more specific national examples that might be more relevant, but they don't really fit into a general discussion of blesses. Wasteland Survival, like all the survival skills, kind of go in the same category, which is that they aren't bad per se, because movement, having powerful movement is a really big tactical advantage, right? However, they're limited and what I would call niche because, of course, if you don't need to move through a wasteland, you're not getting any benefit from it. And you can only benefit from it when you have sacred troops led by a sacred commander. So to really benefit from this, you need to know that you're going to want to move your sacred units a good distance to attack unexpectedly, and you're going to need to be able to recruit these fully sacred armies and make use of them in that way. And the thing is that if you're spending points on these blesses like Wasteland Survival and like Water Walking or Swamp Survival farther down, right? If you're spending points on these, then you're not spending points on making your sacreds more combat effective, which, inherently that means that when you get there to fight something, they're not going to be as good at that as they would have been if you had saved those points and spent them on combat power. So I'm not going to discount the idea that you could find some way to make use of the tactical flexibility that this would grant you. I'm sure there's someone who could figure out a way to do it. But I think for the most part, it's going to be a rare scenario where that is better than just making your sacreds better at combat, right? And perhaps leveraging national advantages in terms of movement instead. Yeah, so it's kind of something you really have to work to make valuable. Potentially, it's less true of Wasteland Survival, but for some things like Winter's Gift down here, right, which lets sacred units ignore, I'm kind of skipping around, but let's sacred units ignore penalties from cold climate, right? This is a lot more easy to splash. It's 1 water, it doesn't cost another point, it just means you have to have cold scales. Going cold scales is like a temperature neutral nation or cold 1 nation, and going all into cold 3 and taking this could give you a pretty good home ground advantage if you happen to have room to splash it in there, because you had 1 water magic point free. When you have that choice between minor cold resistance or Winter's Gift, it's a little more 50-50, whereas this is a cross path, fire bless point, death bless point. That means you need to have at least 4 death. It's going to be weird to have the potential to splash for this, but it could happen. And it might be more valuable to you than minor fire resistance or than superior morale plus 1 point of undying, for example. So that's the kind of case where you might pick it up. All right, so moving on to the more powerful abilities, we've got Attack Skill. Attack Skill is good for fairly obvious reasons. Your unit's attack skill is their chance to hit an enemy. If they have higher attack skill than an enemy's defense, it's very good. If they have lower attack skill than an enemy's defense, it's very bad. So having higher attack skill is really good. Especially for units that have multiple attacks, right? Where you're reducing let's put it a different way. You're increasing the odds that each attack will hit, and you're increasing the odds that all your attacks will hit, which essentially just means that you're increasing the DPS of your troops, right? That's pretty valuable. I mean, that's what sacreds are for, is killing things a lot more efficiently than your other troops. Some sacreds are a little bit more about survival, but killing things efficiently is very important because in a lot of ways, the only way to win against superior forces in Dominions is to how to put it, to use terminology from other games, DPS tank it, right? Kill them so fast that they can't take out your elite units, right? If they keep dying, they can't attack you, type thing. And this is represented in various ways throughout the game. To go off on a bit of a tangent, you have to have some sort of way to gain an edge, right? And that's for powerful units like super combatants, that means a fear aura or a strong fatigue aura, so that the enemy units will slowly become disabled and then eventually be able to kill them and rout them. For a lot of sacreds though, for example Jaguar warriors, what it really means is just killing a lot of enemy units so that there are less units to attack you, and eventually so that the enemies will rout, right? And then you'll be able to kill even more of them as they run away. So attack skill is very good. In general, I would highly value raising offensive ability, because if your sacreds don't have high offensive ability, they're going to need something else, right? Fear or heat aura or something like that. And probably, we'll talk about that more as this video goes on, but probably you're not going to get that from a bless. You're going to want them to have that baseline and bless in different directions. Now, there are some exceptions, of course, like, the Nephil giants, right, don't actually attack things, right? So attack skill doesn't help their offense. They fatigue enemies to death, basically, right? They just have to survive, and eventually they will disable their enemies, right? And it's this, or that's what I'm trying to get at with the whole, you have to DPS tank, right? You have to take out enough enemies to protect yourself. Well, in the case of Fear Auras, it makes them run away, and in the case of Fatigue Aura, it will cause them to fatigue out at 100 fatigue and fall unconscious. And basically, you hit that break point where they can no longer attack your Sacreds, and your Sacreds stop taking damage, right? And this is true for not just Sacred units, but powerful thugs and super combatants. And so at that point, you can start winning the battle. Maybe by slowly hacking the enemy army to death, or because they'll actually flee off the battlefield and you'll outright win, or because that ability will kill them, right? Or because the ability was killing them, okay? So you have to, stabilize, all right? So attack skill is, of course, valuable for that for a certain type of unit. It's, of course, much less valuable on units like Nephil Giants. Anything with only one attack, anything that is more dependent on survival to win, right, than on attacks. So people with auras, that fear auras and hot, heat, and cold auras, and some Sacreds that are just probably not that super good anyway, because they only have one attack ability. Also, units with excessively high attack skill, this is probably a little redundant on. It's super value on units, for example, like Flagellants, which are very cheap. They get 2 attacks per turn, and they have terrible stats baseline. So 2 attack skill for them is like a 20% boost. And in terms of their ability to hit average units, it's actually, I think, a good bit more than that. So it's very valuable. That was an overly complicated discussion, but hopefully that'll give you some ideas for the rationale why would I say that? Yeah, poor word choice. Yeah, great, poor word choice. Behind other choices that I'm going to recommend in terms of blesses, right? Like, later on we'll talk about regeneration, and right here we'll be talking about awe and how they factor into that equation of getting you to that point where you can overcome the enemy army and win the battle. And the trick is to do that before your units actually die, right? And doing it before you suffer any casualties at all is like the ideal with elite Sacred units. Okay, so moving on. Inspirational Presence. Inspirational Presence is another utility type ability. It's pretty decent. It's rare that I want to spend 4 points of fire magic on this. However, I will say one thing you can do is if you want to pick up fire magic for its pathing, right? Because you want your nation to have access to fire magic in the late game, and you're not taking an Awakened Pretender. You're not taking this bless for any Sacred units at all. You're doing it as a mage bless, right? And you want it for your commanders. This is a great ability because you could pick up 4 fire magic for other purposes, like crafting staves of elemental mastery and whatnot, or just casting big fire spells. And you could get this bonus, which, unlike anything else here, is going to benefit your regular troop leading commanders potentially. In particular, it would be good for nations where you would expect your mages to actually be leading troops, because often your elite commander, you'll have an elite commander for the nation, which is much more worth recruiting these days, and he would be leading the troops, and he would not be Sacred in most cases. This isn't the case for every nation, of course. Some nations, those guys might be Sacred, in which case this is super value, right? Because you can get a extra inspirational, really high leadership commander out of it. Anyway, so it's a utility niche thing for when you're not doing a bless strategy, like the revolving around your actual troops. Okay, so Death Explosion. I talked about this a little bit earlier. It's probably pretty terrible, but maybe you can find a niche use for it. I've seen some people mention that Abyssia can use this on their Sacreds. Of course, it's a little bizarre to me because maybe it's true for middle and late age, but Abyssia's Sacreds are actually quite good, especially in the early age, and you probably want them to actually be effective, or you're ignoring them entirely. And so it's kind of hard to see a situation where Death Explosion is really worth it for Sacreds that are so expensive and so good, right, if you were actually using them. The middle age and the late age ones, I don't know if I really value them as highly, but they're still not like cheap and plentiful, right? They're a fairly limited resource. They take a lot. Use a lot of resources to recruit. They're fairly expensive gold wise. They're not cheap enough to where I would see this as being useful. Where I would really see this as being useful would be on a nation like Mictlan or Middle Marignon, where you have Recruit Anywhere Sacreds, except they're not in a good position to use it. And the reason, incidentally, if you aren't getting this, that it's good for Abyssia, theoretically, is because they have such high fire resistance that you wouldn't need to pick up an additional fire resistance bless to make your other Sacreds immune for it. So when they die, they would just explode and damage enemy units, but not your own units, which makes it a lot more valuable than if it sets off a chain reaction that wastes all of your exploding Sacreds. But yeah, it's probably still not worth it. That said, there's a good possibility people will find a use for it. I think in particular, there could be a use for it on nations with readily available flying Sacreds. Like I could conceivably see this being used on Jabalba. I could conceivably see this being used on Nazca, because you can fly in your sacred units to the enemy backline, right? And the hope is that they will go to the backline and die and explode enemy mages, in which case this is quite good value. And if you have chaff sacreds that you can do this with, it's fairly worthwhile to take out like 2 enemy units with the death explosion with your crappy sacred. Of course, it's still... There's still the fact that you have to invest in having this bless, right? It's Fire 5. You're probably going out of your way to get this as any nation. So when you're doing that, and if it's not getting you great value, it's not necessarily worth it when you could be doing something else, right? With those points. You could be getting more scales. You could be getting an expansion pretender. You could be getting a mage bless with like precision and reinvigoration, which we'll be talking about the value of later. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm super convinced on it. So this is a bit weak, but potentially has weird niche uses. Also, if you just want to have some fun versus the AI, it's hilarious. So it has that to the advantage. I recommend combining it with swiftness and fire resistance and going ham on that shit. Okay, so let's talk about some more useful things. Heat Aura. Heat Aura is pretty good. It's another kind of difficult to use one. I could conceivably see it being good on very spammable sacreds or very durable sacreds or some sacreds that are a combination of both, right? The thing is that it takes time for it to work, right? Your sacred has to kind of sit in front of the enemy and let them gain fatigue each turn. So how the fatigue aura works, if I recall correctly, is that they will be dealt 5 fatigue damage every turn and in a radius of 3 around your unit. So it's not a lot. It's going to take like 5 to 10 rounds of combat for this to really make a difference, right? And they don't stack with other units being next to each other, apparently. I'm not sure it's 100% correct. I just read someone said that, and it's been so long since I looked into the mechanics, I'm not 100% sure myself. But I believe they don't stack. And yeah, it creates this kind of situation where it would be quite good versus thugs and versus very tough enemy units. Like, for example, if your opponent has, I don't know, if your opponent is like middle Pangea and has regenerating centaurs, or if your opponent is, I was going to say early age Abyssia, but that's a terrible example because they'd be immune to it. But there's a cold aura that's equivalently the same. So, some nation with very tough sacreds that regenerate and your units just can't kill them, right, on their own. Well, if you have the Heat Aura, eventually they'll hit 50 fatigue and they'll start bleeding crit, and they'll probably die at that point. But if they didn't, eventually, even farther into the future, they will hit 100 fatigue, pass out, and get annihilated. And the same would go for thugs, right? Like, this could be a good way to deal with a pesky elf horsemen, right, running around and killing your troops. The real problem with this is it's just too easy to counter, right? Like if it counters the enemy sacreds All right, that's a fair point, but I'm not sure it counters the enemy sacreds better than, giving your sacreds flaming weapons, right? Or something else you could do to boost the offense of your sacreds. And if it's to counter thugs, well, the enemy could probably counter that counter by giving their thugs some form of fire resistance. Most thug nations are going to have access to something that boosts their resistances in some way. And if nothing else, many of them could evade your counterattacking sacreds. So, bit of a quandary. I'm not convinced it's very good at all. But, in general, Fedoras are fairly decent. So it could be good. It could be good. I think it's just not necessarily very value. I think the Cold Aura might actually be better because it can freeze people. I should mention that in Heat 3 it becomes more effective and I believe sets people on fire, and people with fire weakness would get seriously fucked up by Heat Auras. So if you would expect to fight like Niflheim, this could gain a lot of value. Okay, Fire Shield. So Fire Shield is another stinker, or maybe the only real stinker in fire magic in terms of blesses. Because, so Fire Shield deals 6 AP damage to anyone who strikes you, but that damage is reduced for each length of the enemy weapons. The enemy's weapon, excuse me. So fists and feet are length 0, so they wouldn't get any reduction in damage taken. And like stuff like daggers are length 1, and like short swords. Stuff like, I think axes might be length 1 as well, but once you get into stuff like long swords and stuff, it's length 2. The various swords are length 2. Great swords are probably also length 2. It's a pretty broad category. Spears and stuff are length 3. Long spears are length 4, and pikes are length 5, right? So it's pretty common practice to fill your infantry lines with spearmen, because weapons with a longer length have value. In particular, you can repel people if you have a longer weapon than them, and I could probably make a whole different video on combat mechanics and repels and stuff, but I'm just going to assume you know what it is or can look it up for now. So there's a good reason that people would have as long of length weapons as they can find to attack through Fire Shield with, which means that really you're going to take 5 to 2 AP damage, probably. As little as 1, potentially, but few nations have access to pikes. So the thing is that 2 AP damage, or 3 AP damage, or even 4 AP damage is just not that great. 4 is a little bit more okay, but versus length 3 weapons when you're only getting 3 AP damage, it's pretty bad. And you have to get attacked to deal that damage to your attackers, right? So there's kind of an issue here in that 3 AP damage versus 10 armor means that it's going to treat the armor as 5 armor, and so that half the time it's going to not do any damage. Not half the time, but a lot of the time it's not going to do any damage. The exact percentile is a little more complicated in Dominions, but half the time it's not going to do any damage. So not super good in my opinion. If it was just straight up 6 AP damage, or even just straight up 5 or 4 AP damage and had no length damage reduction, I would probably consider this to be better. If it scaled with Pretender's fire magic strength, it'd probably be better, but it doesn't do any of those things. It's kind of bad. There is something to be said for the fact that if you have a very tough unit and it's being attacked by many enemy units, and they don't have very long length weapons. Let's assume length 2 at most, so they're taking 4 AP damage. If those units are, especially if those units are chaff, it is going to be fairly effective against them, right? Versus 10 armor, it's still not going to deal any damage on average, but if, you spend 3-4 rounds in combat being beat up by 5 or 6 or 10 other units, the amount of effective attacks you're going to get against them with this Fire Shield is a lot more than your unit could probably make itself against these units. And so in that way it has some value, but it's really limited compared to other bless options in that it requires you to be attacked. It requires them to have at least, not length 4 or 5 weapons. Otherwise, it's going to be very ineffective. And even against length 3, it's not great. And once you get down to length 2, it starts to be okay. But it's very, very limited in that way. So I'm not a fan of this bless, especially at the cost. Fire 6 is just too high. If it was Fire 5 or 4, it might be a little more reasonable in my books, but not that great. Flaming Weapons, on the other hand, much better. Why? Well, it's AP 6, the exact same as Fire Shield is initially, but it's not mitigated by anything except having a lot of armor. So, this advantage, of course, is that you're going to hit less units with this, but the fact that it stays at AP 6 makes a big difference, because at AP 6, against 10 armor, it's going to treat it as 5. It's going to deal damage on average most of the time, right? And versus 12 protection, it's still going to deal damage half the time on average, right? Roughly. I need to review the stats calculation for Dominions, but there's like a curved fall off, so it's a little bit weird how being exactly at or below a breakpoint works. Anyway, so and then versus higher amounts of armor, it's going to still have a better chance of getting some damage through, right? So because of that, Flaming Weapons tends to be a lot more effective versus like non-chaff infantry, right? Units that are actually armored at all. Not armored a lot, because if they're armored too much, like if they have like 18 armor, this is going to be relatively ineffective. But as long as they're armored somewhat, like a lot of medium to heavy infantry are in the early and middle ages, this is gonna be good versus them. Okay, and that's why I think like Fire Shield is partly Fire Shield is a little lame, because Flaming Weapons exists. Now, of course, like I mentioned, with having a big tough unit that gets beat up a lot, making Flaming Shield sound like a better, or Fire Shield sound like a better idea. Flaming Weapons is not particularly useful on a unit that has only one attack, right? And it's only going to attack one time per turn. So I would not recommend getting this on any sort of two-handed unit, any unit that uses like a shield and a one-hander. You need your units to have at least 2 attacks to really get the benefit out of Flaming Weapons. It can still be good, but you're not getting a very cost-effective boost to your unit's power compared to, say, making them more durable, or perhaps even considering the usually weaker option of a Heat Aura, or well, actually, I can't recommend a Fear Aura. We'll get into that later, but it's a bit expensive. So yeah, the one nice thing about it that would make me consider it, even on a unit that it's ineffective on, that has only like 1 attack per turn, is that it is magic damage, right? So it will penetrate things like Ethereal, it'll penetrate things like Mist Form, it'll penetrate things like Glamour, and so for that purpose, it's very valuable, right? And it can help you counter certain things. So even if it's a little bit inefficient, it might still be worthwhile to pick up something that boosts your offense while also countering these things if you expect them to be a problem for you. On the other hand, Awe at Fire 7 is one of the best blesses available, right? For any amount of points. I guess it would be kind of bad if it cost 10 points, but Awe is really good. It's really good on units that don't have it in game already, in particular, right? Because what it does is it forces enemy units to make a morale check, and I believe Awe 1, I think it's a morale check against 10 plus the Awe value, so it would be against 11 morale, right? And quick review, if you don't know, when any check in Dominions is a 2d6 dice roll opposed, so that means that the units trying to strike them will roll their morale plus 2d6, and the unit with Awe will, I believe, roll 11 as their like morale check plus 2d6. So versus chaff units, this has a very good chance, like a better than 50-50 of not allowing them to attack you. And versus more elite units, it still has a chance of preventing them from attacking you. And preventing attacks is really the best form of protection in melee combat, because if your unit has decent defense skill in particular, when they're attacked, they'll get a harassed penalty, which reduces their defense skill by 2, even if they dodge the attack, right? Because they have too high of defense to be hit. So, since Awe prevents the attack entirely, you don't get the defense penalty. So this is particularly good for very high defense units or like cavalry units that only take a -1 penalty when harassed and tend to have higher defense. So a unit with very high defense, and maybe you would go into water and get the defense skill for +2, so maybe you have 14 or 16 defense. Preventing a bunch of attacks allows you to take a smaller number of attacks, and perhaps the small number of attacks that actually are made against you are few enough that you can evade all of them with your defense, or have a pretty good chance of evading them all with your defense, right? And if you have fairly high protection as well, it basically just reduces the odds that someone's going to get a crit on you and actually deal some damage through your protection. So yeah, it's really good as a form of damage mitigation. Now, what it's not good at is protecting units that have low protection. And the reason for that is if units have low protection, they can be shot with arrows. And arrows, or any sort of ranged attack, ignores the effects of awe, right? It only works in melee. And so if you have low protection, your sacreds are just going to die pathetically to ranged units and like waste this great expense you've shelled out to give them awe, right? It's just not going to do anything useful. But as long as they already have decent protection and they're units that don't have to worry about archers very much, it's a really good bless. And if you, of course, give them some other blessing that would protect them from archers, then you've solved that problem. So just keep in mind that that is a glaring weakness in the ability. However, in terms of like fighting troops in melee, I'm not sure there's any other single bless that gives you an equal amount of durability. Even regeneration is probably not as good for those purposes. Yeah, maybe on certain giant units that already have decent protection, you could expect it to give you as much value over time, but not always. The other thing to keep in mind, I should say, is that mindless and undead units, because undead are mindless, so I guess it's just mindless and other high morale units. Mindless units have 50 morale, so they're going to always succeed that morale check versus awe. And berserk units, when they go berserk, have 99 morale, so they're going to succeed the morale check versus awe. And certain other units are going to have, certain other units are going to have really high morale, like 18 or 20 or something, and are going to very easily pass your awe, right? So this is really good versus like not undead, like non-mindless infantry that are not like super elite badasses. Versus other sacreds, it's going to be less effective, although, of course, other sacreds tend to have attacks that are much more damaging, so blocking only 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 attacks, if they're from other sacreds, is still pretty good. Although, not as great as something else like ethereal, which we'll talk about later. Okay, moving on to air magic. So we can speed this along a little bit by saying, look, you got minor shock resistance. Same things are true of minor shock resistance that I've said of minor fire resistance, just in dealing with air magic and air evocations and such. So, you take it for the same reasons. Now, precision, there's a little bit more to say about. Precision increases the accuracy of spells and ranged attacks, like firing a bow. Now, a precision bonus is pretty solid, right? 10 precision is the average, 12 is pretty good precision. Getting mages with higher than normal precision is very rare in Dominions, right? You should value it. It's pretty easy to get +4 precision from taking 4 in air magic on your pretender, and it's really valuable. +4 precision is a huge bonus in Dominion's terms, and it's going to stack, I believe, with other spell bonuses that mages can cast, like Eagle Eyes for themselves. So if you have a all sacred mage line, this is a very valuable option for increasing the power of your mages if you're going to be casting evocations. Things like Thunderstrike and Fireball and the like. They're really going to benefit a lot from higher precision. Something to keep in mind, of course, though, is that certain spells like Mind Burn, Soul Slay, a lot of other astral spells have very high precision already, and it's going to be kind of pointless to buff your precision if you're one of those nations. Like, early HK Lhasa is not going to benefit very much from precision. They can. There are other spells they can cast. They have Earth Mages that can cast Earth spells and such, but in large part, they're going to be spamming spells that have like 100 precision default, so it's not going to make a big difference. Far Shot is pretty much worthless. There are only, what, like 2 or 3, I think only 2 blessed ranged units in the game. So this is garbage. Completely ignore it. I think it maybe would help. I guess it would maybe help some people with javelins. So, but it's still garbage. Swiftness. This is kind of useful, primarily because of the more likely to strike first in combat. Like, movement speed is also helpful. Engaging with the enemy faster before they've had time to pepper you with as many arrows is nice for your sacred units. And if maybe you needed air for some other reason, right? You want 4 air magic so you can make staves of elemental mastery, and you're like, all right, I want it, but I care about my sacred units mostly, not my mages. And so you take swiftness, and then you put 2 in precision anyway, because hey, precision is great. But you take swiftness because it does give your units a slight combat edge with that ability to strike first, especially against certain units that might be very dangerous, like barbarians or other sacreds that are going to do a lot of damage per hit. And if you can kill them immediately, right, if you can get in the first hit and actually kill them with that hit, it's very valuable. Charged bodies. This spell is garbage. I wish it was decent, but it hurts your unit and it hurts the enemy unit for 10 armor negating damage. So that's quite a sizable amount of damage. You're gonna fuck up yourself and the enemy fairly decently, but it only happens once per battle. It hurts you and your opponent. There are a lot more useful things than this. I mean, like Fire Aura Fire Shield that I was dissing earlier would probably deal more total damage for most sacreds than charged bodies, simply because you would get attacked a fair number of times before dying, assuming you have fairly decent sacred units. Whereas this will hasten your own death. It's terrible. I will say there's one good use for it, and that is to combine it with Death Explosion for extra hilarity when goofing around against the AI. Other than that, though, I would not consider it at all. Windwalker, too expensive. Being able to march about 1 province further per month, and it's incarnate too. I would think that would be pretty decent if it was 3 or 4 points and not incarnate. Yeah, all the same things I've said about Wasteland Survival and other survival types apply to Windwalker, except that it's more expensive and it's incarnate only, which I don't like. Air Shield. Air Shield is very niche. It's useless on most sacreds. However, some sacreds get a huge benefit out of it. Early Age Kael'thasa is a great example of a nation that can actually benefit from this bless fairly significantly. Air Shield, blocks 80% of any projectiles, right, that get shot at you. And it's really good for Kael'thasa for a couple of reasons. So one is that Kael'thasa would really like to take Bark Skin or Stygian Skin on their sacreds. Now, Stygian Skin is invulnerability, and that is negated by a magical attack, like, say, flaming arrows. And Bark Skin gives you weakness to fire, which means that if you're hit by a flaming arrow, you will definitely die. Maybe not instantly, but you'll burn to death over time. And so negating 80% of any projectile that is flaming, for example, would be a great way to up the survivability of your units. Now, something I would throw in here is that if you take Bark Skin, I would recommend getting fire resistance or something to counteract that whole burning to death weakness. But even if you don't, suppose you take Stygian Skin, or suppose you take neither. Suppose you go with some other bless option that I haven't suggested, and you also take Air Shield. Well, that gives you the advantage of being able to do something like cast Storm, so now even more projectiles are lost, and it makes casting flaming arrows fairly pointless. And so now you can cast Mass Protection, which gives your units weakness to fire, and despite the fact that flaming arrows should obliterate your army in this case, if your army is mostly sacreds with Air Shield and you've also got Storm up, you're not going to lose a whole lot of units to flaming arrows, actually. In general, archers are a very valuable part of armies and dominions, and your sacreds are going to be taking a lot of fire for archers, no matter what nation you're playing or what their weaknesses are. And so this is still going to be a fairly valuable choice, but I think on units with enough protection to mostly shrug off arrows, for like 7, actually it's only 6 bless points, but for 6 or 7 bless points in a path, you could take something like regeneration if you weren't playing a nation with that huge glaring weakness that Kael'thasa has of having so little protection and only being able to counteract that low protection with other things that are countered by buffs to archers. For other nations, it's just more worth it to take something like regeneration and say like, all right, look, maybe occasionally my units will get plinked by an archer shot, but they'll heal it up. And this will also give them benefit when they're fighting units in melee versus Air Shield that gives you no benefit at all when you're fighting a unit in melee, but more protection, relatively speaking, versus arrows, right? Thunder Weapons. Thunder Weapons is probably not good because it's too expensive, right, at 7 air bless points, but it's better than it sounds. In particular, that 3 AN fatigue damage can stun units, which disables them, right? Which is very valuable. And 1 AN capped damage, so you're just doing 1 armor negating damage. It's pretty useless, but versus certain super heavily armored units that you would barely touch otherwise, you'll actually be affecting them fairly heavily like this. If your normal attacks can't do any damage, well, you're going to get 1 damage through, and you're going to fatigue them. And once they build up enough fatigue, you're going to start critting them and doing real damage to them. So, I haven't tested Thunder Weapons extensively. I think I will in the near future, but suffice it to say that this is actually pretty decent. I think its niche is really not like chaff units that you can chew through, right? And for the most part, compared to Sacred's, most units are chaff units, right? So for considering how expensive it is, I haven't found a good use for it yet. But I wouldn't label it bad. I might, out of the different like weapons, there's flaming weapons and there's frost weapons, and we'll get to is it only there's poison weapons and death weapons and stuff. Out of all the various weapon options, I might put thunder weapons near the bottom, but it's not terrible per se. Death weapons might be worse. Probably. I'm not a huge fan of death weapons, and we'll get to that later, but the TLDR is that it's because their magic resistance negates, and magic resist negating is pretty disappointing. Yeah, I think that about sums it up. So, Thunder Weapons, it's relatively weak, but that stun effect is quite good. Could be a valuable buff on low damage, decent number of attacks, Sacreds, right? It's like some kind of chaff Sacreds, maybe Flagellants. I've considered it on them. In particular, I still would probably prefer to pick up like flaming weapons, but something to mention is that if you want air magic on your pretender, you have like a reason to want air magic on your pretender, or for the nation you're playing, an air chassis would be much cheaper. Or maybe, I don't know if there is a nation that has this bonus, but if there was a nation that had an air magic bonus, that could change the equation, right? So in all of these, and a quick note in general for the future videos, in all these evaluations where I'm talking about like how good these things are, some of them are inherently useless, like Death Explosion, right? Where it's like it's super hard to find a use for it. Or what's the one I was really dissing? Far Shot. It's garbage. Until they add like 10 more nations with Sacred Art, Recruit Anywhere Archers, it's garbage. So there's a couple that are inherently just crap. But for the most part, any of these where I'm talking about the balance of them, it's relative to their cost, right? You know, of course Fire Shield would be good for 2 points. It would be obscene, right? But for the relative cost, the things that I'm saying are like good or not good are hard to justify. And there are other things that can change the relative cost, and that can be what pretender access nations get and what national bonuses they get to bless points. And in particular, this could change in the future. I mean, this Dominions 5 has just recently come out, and you could be watching this video in the future when they've added more nations, they've added more pretenders, they've maybe given more nations national bonuses to bless paths, and it may be the case that a some nation is very easy to pick up thunder weapons, in which case, if thunder weapons are much cheaper for you than flaming weapons, then it's a great idea. The thing is, though, that as is, flaming weapons are probably better than thunder weapons overall, like in general, and they cost 1 bless point less, which is why I don't value thunder weapons that highly, even though they have a neat, unique benefit, right? Okay, so thank you all for watching. I'll be back soon with my videos on Earth and Water, and Astral and Death, and Nature and Blood. When my throat has had time to recover. I guess this video series is going to be very long. I guess I'm going into a lot of depth, but I hope it's actually beneficial. Thank you for watching.